Good morning everybody, unless of course you're watching this video in the evening. In that case, good evening, and you're watching Time Travel TV, and today we're going to be talking about the American Civil War. That's why I'm dressed in the fashion of an American. Of course, all Americans dress like this every day. Of course they do. Anyway, so basic facts you need to know first. The American Civil War started in 1861 and ended in 1865. And it was a war between the Union, more colloquially known as the North, and the South, the Confederacy, more colloquially known as the South. So how did it start? Well, many people would say that's slavery. And to be honest, slavery was probably the main reason, but it wasn't the only reason. There's a lot more stuff going on around at the time. Anyway, the North were known as free states. They didn't have slavery. But the South were known as slave states. They did have slavery. It was important at this time that there was an equal number of slave states to free states, because they didn't want the slave states to overpower the free states in politics, and vice versa. And a conversation started arising, and a bit of an argy-bargy started arising when they started expanding west into the Great Plains, because new states like Texas and California started to arise. And were these to be free states or slave states? Because they couldn't upset the balance of free states and slave states. And this is where the conversation started to arise. Things came to a head in the election of 1861. Things were brewing up quite a bit beforehand, but in 1861 the election really started to, things heated up by quite a bit. There were two main parties at the time, which was the Democratic Republicans, which is not a confusing name. There's definitely not the two parties called the same thing nowadays, and the Democrats. The Democrats back then were, unlike now, they're associated with more progressive liberal attitudes. Back then, they were associated more with the conservative side of things. The Democratic Republicans ended up splitting over the slavery argument and became a new party called the Republicans, which were the more liberal progressive party rather than the more conservative party we've got today. So what we've got now, the man who was their candidate for the Republicans was a chap called Abraham Lincoln, who's a very important person. And what happened is that he didn't get any votes in the South at all. The South didn't vote for him at all. In fact, he didn't even appear on their ballot paper. This made them very cross. And with a few other reasons, they started to secede. This means to break away, because you have to remember, back then, the Americans didn't see themselves as one country, as we do now. They wouldn't say the United States is a nice place to live. They would say the United States are a nice place to live. They saw it as a collection of states rather than a country, if you know what I mean by that. Many of them saw their state loyalty as stronger than their national loyalty. So what happened was they started to secede because they saw that their state had a right to break away from the Union if they so wished. So what happened is that eventually the whole of the South had broken away from the North, and it became what we now know as the Confederacy. And the North we now know as the Union. Although coincidentally not all slave states were in the South. There were slave states which were never seceded and never left the North, like Delaware, for instance, is one that just happens to come to mind. Anyway. So what happened was the South had to build a nation. The Confederacy had their own capital city in Richmond. They also had a president who was called Jefferson Davis. So anyway, the Civil War started between the North and the South because Abraham Lincoln turned around and said, "Hey, you can't do that. You just can't do that." And Jefferson Davis turned around and said, "Well, we just did, so deal with it, Abe." Anyway, the American Civil War started. Abraham Lincoln wanted to get the South back into the Union. Jefferson Davis wanted the South to be his own country, to be the Confederate States of America, and they wanted to be the United States of America. So it very nearly became two countries, and for a while it was. And the South started to win. They were doing pretty well at the start. The Confederacy was doing really well, even though their disadvantages. For instance, Their manpower was really low. The Union had 22 million population. The Confederacy had 9 million population, and 3 million of those were slaves. So they're unlikely to be sympathetic to the Confederate cause. Not only that, the Union could produce more infrastructure. They had more infrastructure. They had more railroads. They were able to produce more stuff. They had a bigger army. They had a bigger navy, and they even had a navy. The Confederacy did have a navy, but it was really, really, really small. So the Confederacy started to win, and it looked as though they were, because of their new tactic. They wanted to get a foreign power on side. They knew that by themselves it would be very difficult, almost impossible, to win the war. So they needed a foreign power. The foreign power would probably be a European power. Britain looked like the obvious choice, because they relied heavily on cotton exports. So what happened was, at the start of the war, Abraham Lincoln was purposely playing down the slavery aspect. And what then happened was that he thought, well, maybe if I bring the slavery aspect back into it a little bit, then that will deter countries like Britain from joining the war. Because they really wouldn't want to be seen as supporting an army or a country that represents slavery when they've already abolished slavery 30 years prior. So they did, and countries like Britain and other European powers like France, for instance, they said, hey, we don't really want to be on the side of Confederates because they associate with slavery and we want to get away from that. Coincidentally, this was also very important for world history. For instance, Britain then looked to Asia to build an empire and invested in that a lot more, which is why Britain had a much bigger presence in countries like India, for instance, and China, rather than in continents like North and South America. Anyway, the Confederacy, that was really one of only probably 3 chances of winning the war. The other chance came at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is really the last time they threatened a northern city. If they'd won the Battle of Gettysburg, panic probably would have broken out across the north. They would have been able to barge their way through, and probably the Union war effort may have even collapsed. But this didn't happen because Robert E. Lee didn't quite win. He not only didn't quite win, he didn't win at all. If he did win, it could be a completely different story, and we could be looking at the Union and the Confederacy as 2 different countries. The third chance came in 1864, and this was probably their biggest chance, the most likely chance they had. And it was the election, because maybe you'll forget that Abraham Lincoln had to be re-elected to become president again, because presidents only serve a 4-year term, and he'd been president since 1861, and 1864 came along, 4th year came up, he had to get re-elected. So what happened was that he was running against a person called McClellan, and McClellan was also a general in the American Civil War, and his policy on it was slightly different to Abraham Lincoln's. Abraham Lincoln's policy was to see the war to its conclusion with a Union victory. And McClellan, yeah, he wasn't so keen. He wanted just to give them their independence and just go on as 2 separate countries. And this was quite a popular belief in the Union, because people were getting bored with the war. The war was incredibly costly. It cost a lot of money, not only in financial money, but in lives. This was the most bloody war in American history. 700,000 people died, which is more in that one war than any other American war combined, whether it be Revolutionary or, England, so we call it the War of Independence. The First War, Second World War, Korea and Vietnam. So it was an incredibly bloody war. We think of now a bloodbath will be casualties of 10% there, about 30%, and some battles were between 30, some were 40 up to 50% of their armies just dead. It was so bloody. So many people died. So this is why it was really unpopular. Until a chap called Sherman, who was a general, coincidentally they named the Sherman tank, the M4 Sherman tank after him, a chap called Sherman captured the city of Atlanta, which all of a sudden all the Union people said, hey, this war's cool, just get behind it, hey! And what happened was Abraham Lincoln became president for a second time, and coincidentally not very long, became president for a second time, and was able to see the war to its conclusion. It ended in 1865, which saw the surrender of Robert E. Lee, who's a legendary general, absolutely amazing general, saw his surrender to Ulysses S. Grant, who later became president, and he was also a really, really good general, by the way. They're really good, both those generals. In fact, they had met once before at Sandhurst, but not Sandhurst, West Point. Sandhurst in Britain, West Point's in America. Anyway, they had met before once at West Point, but it was but that was when Grant was a pupil, and what's his face? Oh no, what's his name? Lee came did a lecture there. Anyway, so that was the end of the American Civil War. The slaves were freed, or not quite freed. I'm going to do another video on that another time, because that is so complicated, the freeing of the slaves. But we'll just do it really simply and say the American Civil War ended and the slaves were freed, okay? That's really controversial and also completely false. Do not write that in an essay. Don't you write that in an essay, whatever you do. Because that's, not only is that racked with controversy, it's also false, but it's simple enough for us, because we're only talking about the American Civil War, not slavery today. The American Civil War was over. And thus ended the bloodiest conflict in all American history. Abraham Lincoln was hailed as a hero and was president for many more years. Was he? Was he? No? No? Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, he went and he got assassinated because what happened was that he wanted to, his wife wanted to go to the theatre. He said, not really keen on it. And he said, oh right, it's a really good play. It's an English play called Our American Cousins. And they said, oh alright, I'll go. So he went, and that was a big mistake really. He shouldn't have gone, because he was shot by a very disgruntled Southerner who thought that they should have won the war. And that is the end of the American Civil War. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. And remember, the American Civil War, in my opinion, is the most important thing that's ever happened in American history. Without a doubt. Most important thing that's ever happened. I mean, American War of Independence, not important at all. Literally, I will do another video one day on the American Revolution, and I will explain to you why it was a monumental con, and why it is nothing like how you read in history books at all. Literally, the country that came out the best of the American War of Independence was Britain. I bet you didn't see that one coming. But anyway, we're not talking about that now. We're talking about the American Civil War, and I'm saying goodbye, and keep safe at home because of this coronavirus, unless of course you're watching this after it's all finished. Goodbye!